At a packed airport during rush hour, an elderly black man in a thick velvet coat, his right arm missing at the shoulder, quietly entered the security checkpoint with his young grandson. They said nothing, but that silence turned heads. A beep from the metal detector. A small medicine vial fell from the boy's pocket. A TSA officer frowned, reached for his radio. One muttered, just loud enough, black skin, one arm, easy to hide things. Moments later, police arrived. The old man was pulled aside, taken away without question. He stood tall, eyes calm. The room fell silent. No one knew, this was the man who'd soon make the entire airport bow its head. What happened next, you won't forget. Stay with us. International airports during peak hours are no place for the slow. People pushed through long, winding lines like a maze, everyone afraid of missing their flight. Security officers were tense, sweat forming on their brows, repeating the same dry instructions over and over. The chaos only got worse that day when the automatic scanning system malfunctioned, forcing all checks to be done manually. The process slowed, pressure mounted on the staff. The atmosphere was stuffy and crowded, and even the smallest reason could push everything over the edge. Amid that scene, an elderly black man quietly stepped into the priority screening area. He wore a thick gray coat, his right shoulder slightly slumped. His right arm was gone, the sleeve hanging empty. Beside him was a young boy, around 11 years old, dragging a bulky backpack. They spoke to no one, simply trying to blend into the flow of passengers inching forward. They didn't stand out, but to some eyes, their difference was enough to draw attention. As the boy's backpack passed through the metal detector, a loud, cold beep echoed. A TSA officer immediately approached, signaling them to stop and requesting the bag be opened for inspection. He rummaged through it quickly and pulled out a small vial of medicine, its silver metal clasp glinting on the cap. His face tightened, he said nothing, but his hand was already twisting the radio. "This is checkpoint B," he said quickly, "unidentified metal object detected. Passenger wearing heavy coat, long sleeve concealing missing right arm. Possible irregularity." That report alone was enough to shift the mood around them. Another TSA agent turned sharply to glance at the elderly man. A third gestured for police assistance. A few nearby passengers turned to look, curious. No one said anything out loud, but the head shakes and suspicious stares were enough to isolate the grandfather and his grandson in the crowd. Minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They didn't yell, didn't panic. They followed protocol, approached calmly, and began escorting the elderly man out of the line. The boy followed anxiously, saying something to them, but no one listened. Meanwhile, a TSA officer muttered quietly, as if stating some truth just for himself, but loud enough for others to hear, "Black skin, one arm, easy to hide things." Someone nearby nodded slightly, didn't speak, but their eyes agreed. The old man heard it clearly. But he didn't turn back, didn't react, didn't say a word. He simply walked with them, back straight, head held high, unshaken. His eyes held something that words couldn't capture, a calm resilience, a deep inner strength that didn't need to shout. No fear, no anger, just a strange serenity. A quiet strength that couldn't be denied. The boy's backpack was placed on the inspection table. The TSA officers didn't ask for permission, nor did they say a word. They opened it as if it were their unquestionable right, as if going through the belongings of a child and a disabled old man required no consent at all. One by one, the items inside were pulled out. A jacket, school books, a pair of brand new sneakers, a few snack packs for the long flight. But when they reached the side pocket, a small object slipped out and rolled to the edge of the table. It was a metal pill bottle, old-fashioned, with a bright silver clasp. It rolled a few times, then stopped right in front of a TSA agent. He picked it up with 2 fingers, as if touching something dirty. He sneered, then pushed it back onto the table with a firm flick. "Faking illness is a classic trick," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. The boy stared at him, his face flushed with anger. He stepped forward, raising his voice louder than usual. "That's real medicine. It's for my grandpa. You can't do that." His words didn't make anyone pause. On the contrary, another nearby officer burst out laughing. "Who knows," he shrugged, glancing around, "could be explosive meds. Looks like decoy stuff." A woman in the waiting line, overhearing the exchange, couldn't help but comment. "A black man with a priority ticket," she said, eyes fixed on the old man, "that is suspicious." The atmosphere began to shift. All eyes started focusing on the grandfather and the boy. Not because they'd done anything wrong, but because they didn't look like everyone else. Their skin color, their posture, their calmness, it all stood out like a challenge to those used to the typical, trustworthy passenger. The old man turned toward the woman who had spoken, his eyes free of anger. No rebuttal, no raised voice. Just a quiet, steady reply: "No one is suspicious just because of their skin color." His voice wasn't loud, but it made a few people fall silent. It wasn't harsh, but it echoed. Like a forgotten truth. Like a fact that didn't need debating. Still, it wasn't enough to stop what was coming. Somewhere during the exchange, a TSA officer had already lifted his radio. "Requesting backup," he said, "suspicious behavior. Possible concealment of object under clothing. Elderly male, heavy coat, right arm fully concealed." Just a few minutes later, 2 police officers walked in. Sharp uniforms, cold expressions. No greetings. No smiles. They approached the elderly man as if he were a suspect in a serious crime. One rested a hand on his belt, near the handcuffs peeking from under his jacket. The other nodded toward the TSA team: "Conduct a more thorough check." There were no shouts, no physical struggle. But a sense of injustice began seeping into the room. Not because the old man resisted, but because he stayed silent. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he didn't fit what they wanted to see. The metal chair placed in the middle of the hallway wasn't meant for the tired to rest. It was reserved for those seen as a threat. The elderly man was pushed down into it by the officers, without a single word of invitation, without a single question. The hallway was wide but cold, the white fluorescent lights reflecting off the gray tile floor, making everything feel even more sterile. Fewer people passed by, not because they didn't see, but because they didn't want to get involved in anything messy. The boy had been pulled a few steps away. His tiny arms were raised high over his head, thin shoulders tensed, and tears welled at the corners of his eyes. One TSA officer searched the pockets of his jacket, while another swept a scanning device over his body as if looking for something expertly hidden. The child had no idea what was happening. He only knew his grandfather was on one side, he was on the other, and no one was letting them be near each other. A police officer chuckled softly, not looking at anyone in particular, but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear: "Ignorance is guilt too." The comment wasn't directed at anyone, but it cast a shadow over everyone. The boy broke down crying. He couldn't hold it in anymore, nor could he bear it any longer. "My grandpa didn't do anything wrong," he said through sobs. "We're just trying to fly home." No one responded. No one offered comfort. No one explained. A child's emotions were left abandoned in a space governed by grown-up procedures, where protocols were colder than any metal they were searching for. The old man sat still, eyes fixed on his grandson. No struggling, no complaining. He only said one thing, his voice soft like breath: "We are just following the procedure." A TSA officer nearby quickly shot back, without hesitation: Procedure is the excuse, behavior is the truth. His voice wasn't loud, but sharp enough to slice through the air. In their eyes, the old man's cooperation wasn't clarity, it was calculation. Not resisting didn't mean he was innocent. Not fighting back didn't mean he was clean. Another officer stepped forward, offering no warning, no apology, and began unbuttoning the old man's coat. The right sleeve was gently pulled down, revealing an arm amputated at the shoulder. The skin was dark, the scar long faded. No one asked why. No one showed sympathy. They just looked and kept working, as if it was all part of the routine. One TSA agent muttered, "One arm, easier to hide something dangerous." He said it like it was a fact of life, a standard procedure, an offhand remark. No one corrected him. No one pushed back. The words floated into the air like so many others, brushing against someone's dignity but leaving no fingerprints of responsibility. In the midst of the stares and the rough searches dressed as protocol, the old man stayed motionless. His posture never changed. His left hand rested lightly on his knee. His back remained straight. His eyes never left his grandson, nor did they lower. It wasn't because he wasn't afraid. It was because he knew, if he trembled, if he shouted, if he let his anger show, they would be proven right. But if he stayed silent, if he remained standing tall in spirit, he would hold on to his humanity, at least in his own eyes. The metal table in front of the old man was already cold, but now it felt colder still. A TSA officer stepped forward, holding a bottle of water, unopened but crushed slightly at the base from a firm grip. Without saying a word, he tilted his hand, letting some of the water splash onto the surface of the table. The droplets scattered and spread into the dents of the stainless steel. No one objected. No one seemed surprised. It happened naturally, like it was part of the procedure. Almost at the same time, his voice cut through the room, not loud, but sharp enough to be a threat. Anything hidden in that empty sleeve? The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was an accusation dressed up as inquiry. No one in the room paused to wait for a response. The decision had already been made, it didn't matter if something was there or not. The boy's scream shattered the silence that had been pressing down for too long. He couldn't take it anymore. "My grandpa lost his arm in an accident, he's not faking it." His voice strained and cracked at the end. His eyes were red with emotion, his small hands clenched tightly around his coat. He trembled, not from cold, but from being pushed too far away from what he believed was fair. Immediately, another officer nearby laughed out loud, a sound soaked in mockery. "What a performance." The comment passed casually but slammed shut any door to empathy. In their eyes, the boy was no longer a child. The old man was no longer elderly. They were a show, a trick, a situation to be controlled. Without waiting for any reaction, a police officer turned around and slapped the boy lightly on the side of the head. The slap wasn't hard, but the sound was sharp. A small action, but soaked in authority. "Shut your mouth," the officer said, not even looking at the boy, as if he wasn't worth the glance. The room went completely still. In that moment, the old man raised his head. Not in rage. Not to shout. He simply looked directly at the officer, eyes steady and unwavering, and spoke, his voice low and firm, carrying the weight of a life that had seen loss and witnessed the worst of mankind. "You should stop, before it's too late." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The final words of someone who didn't want to fight fire with fire. But the scariest part was, no one listened. They continued. Outside the room, a passenger had been quietly filming the whole incident. They hadn't said a word, just kept recording. But one of the TSA officers noticed. He walked over, calmly extending his hand, "Give me the phone." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. His face wasn't angry, but tightened with the certainty of someone who believed he had the right. The passenger hesitated, didn't respond in time, and another, older TSA agent spoke up. His tone held no attempt to hide his contempt. "You people are a danger to society." None of those insulted said a word. Not because they were weak, but because they understood, any protest would instantly be turned into an offense. And the most painful truth was, those harsh words weren't thrown at the ones who deserved to be exposed, but at the very people trying their best to stay within the last limits of human dignity. The interrogation room was built to strip away every feeling of safety. Harsh fluorescent lights. Pale gray walls, bare and cold. A metal table stood in the center of the room, icy to the touch, its reflective surface distorting the image of whoever sat across from it. There were no cushioned chairs, just two low, hard seats unevenly placed to the side. The door slammed shut behind the old man, sealing him off completely from the outside world. Sealing him off from his grandson, who stood just beyond the glass, crying, being held back by two security guards. No one introduced themselves. No opening remarks. One man stepped forward, holding a rubber baton, tapping it against the table in a steady rhythm, as if marking time. Each tap rang out, dull and heavy. After 3 beats, he leaned in toward the old man and asked in a low voice, purposefully tight with restrained anger, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" It wasn't a real question. It was a verdict disguised as inquiry. The old man raised his head. His face was neither stern nor soft. His eyes were still, like a winter lake. He answered simply and clearly, "A passenger, just like anyone else." The room held its breath for a moment. A TSA officer standing nearby shook his head slightly and smirked, "You don't have any special rights." He said it like the old man had claimed something he didn't deserve. The old man didn't argue. He didn't respond with anger. He merely repeated, gently but with weight, "No one has the right to be humiliated." Each word landed like a stone in still water, not enough to make waves, but enough to make people look down. Another man stepped forward immediately. He was tall, broad, wearing gloves. His voice echoed in the tight space, "In here, I am the law." The atmosphere instantly turned suffocating. This was no longer about airport security. It had become a confrontation, between those in power and someone who had been stripped of his voice. A crackdown dressed up as procedure. A frustrated TSA officer stormed over, leaned in, and yanked the old man's coat collar hard. Not hard enough to knock him over, but enough to send a message, "You are not someone we respect here." "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" he snarled. His face was inches away, eyes wide, voice caught in his throat, angry that the old man wasn't afraid. But the old man didn't flinch. His hands rested calmly on his lap, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. He looked the man directly in the eyes, exhaled slowly, then said, his voice low, raspy, but firm, "You messed with the wrong one." It wasn't a threat. It didn't sound like a warning in the usual sense. It was a simple reminder, needing no explanation. A reminder that some people, without weapons, without size, without even both hands, still carry something immeasurable within them, dignity. And that was something none of them were prepared to face. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the tight room. A TSA officer approached silently, grabbed the old man's remaining wrist, and locked it to the armrest of the chair. The motion was swift, cold, executed as if subduing a dangerous threat. The sound of metal hitting metal rang sharp and clean. No one flinched. Cuffing an elderly man with only one arm was treated as just another part of standard security procedure. Another officer nearby rested his hands on his hips, exhaled slowly, and muttered, as though justifying what they'd done, "One arm still enough to be dangerous." No one asked where the danger was, or how. Because when someone has already been seen as a threat, Any detail can be twisted into a reason. Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed from outside. It was the boy, his grandson, who had broken free and was running toward the room. His face was flushed red, eyes wide with panic. He grabbed the door handle, trying to open it, but another TSA officer stepped in and shoved him back. It wasn't a brutal push, but it was firm enough to send the small boy stumbling backward, slamming into the wall. He shouted, his voice cracked and hoarse, "Don't hurt my grandpa. He didn't do anything wrong." No one answered. No one thought they had to explain anything to a child. Across the hallway, a young passenger was live streaming the entire scene from behind a book, his phone cameras slowly capturing it all, first shaky and dim, then sharper and clearer, revealing the handcuffed man, the pushed child, and the tense, electric atmosphere spreading through the space. Within minutes, hundreds were watching, angry comments beginning to pour in. A police officer spotted it and stepped forward, lifting a bullhorn. His voice rang out, "Stop all recordings immediately. Anyone who continues will be dealt with under airport security law." Some people quickly put their phones away. But others didn't. They stayed where they were, phones held steady, eyes no longer filled with fear, but fury. Inside the isolated room, the old man didn't move. He couldn't. He was cuffed, restrained, unable to do anything. But his gaze hadn't lost its sharpness. He raised his head, looked directly at the officer who had spoken, and said, not loudly, but clearly, deeply, and with enough weight to cut through the room, "Power does not come from threats." No one interrupted. No one objected. Because that sentence needed no defense. He continued, "Control is measured by how we treat those with none." A few eyes shifted away. Someone turned their head. Someone blinked. But no one contradicted him. Because to argue would mean confronting themselves. A TSA officer standing by the door shouted, trying to break the silence thickening in the room, "He's just an old man." The words came out sharp, like a hammer trying to crush the rising sense of empathy. But in that moment, the sentence no longer carried the weight it once did. Because what people saw now wasn't just an old man being checked. They saw a human being, mistreated, yet holding on to dignity. A man, who didn't yell, didn't fight back, but whose presence alone was enough to silence an entire room. And in that silence, the truly powerful began to emerge. Not those with badges or weapons. But the one in handcuffs, who refused to bow. Hurried footsteps echoed down the wide hallway, louder than the tension strung tight in the air. A man in a dark navy suit, his face set and serious, strode with purpose through the security zone as if time itself was chasing him. He didn't stop at the checkpoint, didn't glance at anyone. His eyes were locked on the room where his father was being held. People turned to look. Some stepped aside. Some watched with curiosity. Others instinctively stepped back. The man reached the door and stopped. His voice rang out, clear and firm, without shouting, yet it commanded silence. "Release my father. Right now." It wasn't anger that charged the words, but an unshakable authority. The atmosphere dipped. TSA officers nearby exchanged glances, uncertain. One of them tried to reclaim control, raising an eyebrow with a sarcastic edge in his tone. "And who are you to give orders here?" The man didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on the officer. Then he spoke, calmly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'll know who I am in a few minutes." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply the truth, one he didn't need to rush to explain. Inside the room, the old man turned his head. In that brief moment, his eyes softened. The lines on his face seemed to ease. For the first time since he had been brought there, he looked at someone not with guarded caution, but with familiarity. It was the look one reserves for family, for blood, for the son who needed no words to understand everything. In the packed room, he smiled, a faint, fleeting smile, but warm as the breath of hope. The son stepped closer to the door. His voice lowered, heavy with restrained fury. "What did they do to you?" The old man looked at his son. He didn't elaborate. Didn't recount details. He simply said, quietly, "All the worst things." The man clenched his fists. But his eyes never left the people before him. No one dared speak. Silence spread like a ripple. One TSA officer, flustered, lifted his radio and spoke quickly, "Central, we have an unidentified male claiming to be the son of a detained passenger. Can anyone verify his identity? Need assistance confirming immediately." But before anyone could reply, the man had already pulled a phone from his suit pocket. The movement was swift, precise. The screen lit up. He raised it to his ear and spoke with calm authority, "Pull all surveillance footage from checkpoint 3. From the past 30 minutes to now. Send it to the Federal Coordination System immediately. Include audio, if available." No one moved. No one interrupted. Because in that moment, they all realized, this man wasn't just another random traveler. Not just an angry son. And certainly not someone they could dismiss. His presence alone shifted the balance in the room. Not because he carried power, but because he reminded them of what they had lost, boundaries. And from that moment on, the ones who thought they had control, began to truly lose it. The man stood in the middle of the hallway and quietly pulled a slim leather wallet from the inside pocket of his suit. He opened it slowly, unhurriedly, as if everything was unfolding in a sequence he had long since memorized. The overhead lights caught the clear plastic cover, revealing a silver, embossed badge gleaming in the center of his federal ID. He raised it in front of those who had just interrogated his father. His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold and piercingly clear. "Federal Aviation Inspector. Badge number 4217, F, Department of Homeland Safety Coordination." The room seemed to freeze. It was as if someone had vacuumed the air from the hallway and the room behind the door. Several people immediately looked down. Some glanced nervously at their radios. Others blinked repeatedly. But no one smiled anymore. And no one mentioned procedure or protocol again. The son didn't stop at introductions. He took a step forward, his gaze slowly scanning the faces of those so accustomed to power, now visibly struggling to hide their discomfort. "You've just violated 5 safety protocols in passenger screening." He emphasized every word, leaving no room for denial. "And 3 federal anti-discrimination statutes in the conduct of public officers." He paused. His eyes locked on the man who splashed water on the table, on the one who slapped the child, and on the one who handcuffed his father. No one answered. They stood frozen like students caught cheating, only this time, there would be no one to defend them. He turned to his father, still sitting in the room, one hand cuffed to the chair. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the old man with the gaze of a son who understood all too well the weight his father had carried for far too long. Then he turned back to the others, still stunned into silence. "The man you humiliated isn't just another passenger. He's a veteran who served in the United States Peacekeeping Force. He fought overseas, and he lost part of his body protecting others." His voice sank lower on the last line. Slow, but firm. "And he's my father." No threats were necessary. No accusations needed. That one sentence landed like a blade, slicing through the last traces of arrogance left in the room. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. No footsteps. No radios. Just a raw, undeniable silence. The truth now lay bare. Irreversible. Beyond excuse. Inside the room, the old man slightly bowed his head, then lifted it again. His voice was still calm, still steady, as if merely stating something obvious, I told you from the start. Regret was coming. This time, no one laughed. One TSA officer took a small step backward, each footfall heavy with shame. Another dropped his hand from his belt, eyes downcast. The silence didn't need to be commanded. They all knew they had crossed a line. And the man they thought weak, turned out to be someone far beyond their ability to handle. The son took another step forward. His voice was soft, but weighted. This is no longer a security screening. He looked directly at each member of the team. This is a character screening. And in that room, for the first time since the story began, no one dared to prove they were worthy of passing it. The wail of government sirens echoed from the airport's outer gate, cutting through the awkward silence that had fallen over the screening area. Within minutes, the Federal Investigation Unit arrived. They needed no introductions. No one dared to block their way. Plain suits, ID tags hanging from their necks, and sharp, no-nonsense eyes swept across the scene. One of them pointed, speaking curtly, TSA officers involved in the inspection, suspended immediately. No arguments. No excuses. Each government badge was removed. Scanners were shut down. The same people who, just minutes earlier, had been barking orders and issuing threats now followed the investigators in silence. No one looked at the old man. No one dared glance at his son. One officer, the one who shoved the boy and slapped him, was pulled aside for internal questioning. He walked away with his head lowered, saying nothing. The shiny badge on his chest now seemed heavy and out of place. The son, now the highest-ranking federal aviation official at the scene, stood in the middle of the screening zone. He didn't need to raise his voice. He said one sentence, and everyone heard it: I am ordering the immediate suspension of the entire shift at Screening Area 3. A TSA supervisor's hand trembled as he signed the acknowledgement form. No one asked why. They all knew the reason had been broadcast through every second of silence since the truth came to light. Amid all the tense movement, one thing wasn't about procedure. The boy, his grandson, rushed into the old man's arms the moment the door finally opened, as if he feared his grandfather would vanish if he were even 1 second too late. He burst into tears, not out of pain, but because it was finally over. His small arms wrapped tightly around the old man's shoulder, trembling, refusing to let go. The old man used his one remaining arm to hold the boy close. A firm, gentle embrace. No one said a word. The boy sobbed into his grandfather's chest. I'm sorry. I couldn't protect you. The old man shook his head softly. No. You've already done more than enough. At the end of the hallway, camera shutters began to click. Reporters from major news outlets had arrived. Leaked internal messages and viral video footage had brought them in like a storm. They filmed it all. The tired face of the old man, the steely eyes of his son, and the tears still fresh on the boy's cheeks. A TSA officer, one who had earlier interrogated the old man loudly, watched the scene from afar. He mumbled, unsure if he was talking to someone or just trying to excuse himself, I didn't know who he was. The son turned back. His face wasn't angry. He wasn't smiling. He simply stood and looked at the man who had voiced what everyone else in the room had been thinking. You're right, he said. And that's the biggest problem. He stepped closer. Just enough for his words to land where they needed to, right in the heart of the man standing before him. You don't know who I am, but you should have respected me from the beginning. Not because I'm someone's son. Not because I have power. But simply because we're all human. And if that's not reason enough to be treated with dignity, then the problem was never mine to begin with. That very afternoon, the suspension list was released. Each name was accompanied by specific violations: abuse of power, degradation of human dignity, unnecessary use of force, and breaches of protocol in handling passengers with special needs. Every TSA agent involved, from the one who handcuffed the old man to the one who pushed the child, was suspended immediately, without waiting for explanations. Several airport police officers were also placed under internal investigation for their excessive responses. No one was criminally charged. But no one kept their position either. The true cost wasn't a title, it was the loss of public trust. Within 24 hours, the media exploded. The story appeared on the front page of nearly every major newspaper. Under intense public pressure, the airport leadership was forced to hold a public press conference. Surrounded by microphones and cameras, the airport director spoke slowly and bowed deeply to the lens. On behalf of the entire airport system, I apologize to you, to your family, and to every innocent citizen who has ever been hurt by such unacceptable actions. The incident quickly escalated beyond the bounds of the airport. A week later, the old man was invited to testify in a special hearing before the United States Congress, where lawmakers were reviewing policies on anti-discrimination within public service systems. Before a panel of officials, in front of millions watching live, the old man didn't speak long. He simply recounted what had happened, with no bitterness, no embellishment. And he ended with one sentence: I don't need pity. I need America to see people with human eyes. At the same time, his son, now recognized nationwide as a federal aviation inspector, spoke at a special press conference. He introduced a reform draft for TSA procedures, based on new principles: transparency, humanity, and, most importantly, zero tolerance for discrimination in any form. He stated, there is no reason why a one-armed old man and a small child should become the target of fear, just because their skin is a different color. That line quickly became the lead quote across headlines nationwide. But no one expected the boy, the one who held onto his grandfather in the crowded terminal, to become the story's most powerful symbol. The image of him crying outside the inspection room, then collapsing into his grandfather's arms, was shared millions of times. Artists illustrated the moment. It was printed on the covers of civic textbooks, painted on school walls, and featured in children's magazines. Children saw him as a symbol of courage. Adults saw in him something they had long forgotten: sensitivity, the bravery to speak up, and a pure, unconditional love. 1 week later, a letter arrived at the old man's home. No sender, just a handwritten line: I'm sorry. Inside was a long note, written in shaky handwriting. The writer was the TSA agent who had once grabbed the old man's collar and mocked him as a hidden threat. In the letter, he wrote, I watched the video and saw myself. I didn't recognize that person. Not because you're a veteran. Not because you're the father of someone powerful. But because you are a human being. And I forgot that. The media called him many names. But the one that appeared most, printed on the covers of Time, Forbes, CNN, and even small town papers, was the man who stayed calm in the face of power. They didn't call him a hero. They didn't call him a victim. They called him a symbol of self-possession. Because he didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to fight back to be seen. In a rare national interview, when asked how he felt after everything, he simply smiled. No anger. No sadness. He spoke slowly: mistake is a lesson. Regret is the reward for those who lack respect. No one argued. Because everyone understood, his words weren't meant for one day. They were meant for a country. A society. And for anyone who ever believed they had the right to look down on someone, just because they could. We've just walked through a story that isn't rare in modern society. An elderly black man, a war veteran who lost an arm serving this country, was doubted, humiliated, and treated as a threat, not because he did anything wrong, but simply because he didn't look like what some people wanted to see. An entire system, built to ensure safety, unintentionally became a place where power was misused. where job titles overshadowed conscience, where professional suspicion became a shield for deep-rooted prejudice. But what's more important than the people who were wrong, is the one man who was right, and how he chose to respond. He didn't lash out. He didn't resist. He didn't shout or beg. He simply sat tall, looked injustice in the eye, and chose silence, not as surrender, but as strength. Because he knew, silence isn't weakness. It's a choice, when you understand that you don't need to prove anything to those who have already lost their own value. The boy, his grandson, cried. But those tears weren't just from fear. They came from the pain of seeing kindness treated with cruelty. And that kind of fear should never be something a child has to carry into life. The son, a federal inspector, stood up. Not to seek revenge, but to restore boundaries. To remind those who were wrong, that power won't protect you from consequences. But justice can protect others from the same harm. This story doesn't end with punishment. It ends with change. With brave decisions. With real apologies. And with a lesson we can all take with us. Respect is not a reward reserved for those with titles. Respect is the starting point for every act between human beings. So, if you ever find yourself standing in front of someone you don't understand, don't know who they are, or what they carry, remember this: you don't need to know who they are to treat them with kindness. You only need to know, they are human. And that's enough. If this story made you pause and reflect, share it. If you've witnessed something similar, leave a comment below. And if you believe the world needs more stories that awaken the conscience, subscribe to our channel. We're here to keep telling them. Stories that may seem small, but can change the way someone sees the world. And sometimes, even change the world itself.